So, war ethics again, and now I'm going to talk about ancient Rome. Rome has evolved a lot in the way that its war ethics are oriented. Unlike Sparta, which I've covered before, Rome doesn't have a constant way of life. There are values that it maintains, but it sort of changes from the years of the Republic to those of the Empire. And when you have changes in organizational structure, leadership, what's good for Rome, then obviously war ethics generally change, because it's not so much based on the sentiment of the people, but the culture of the organization of the state. Now, Rome, from its founding, had the idea of war in mind. It thinks of war, of course, as quite negative, as peace being the status quo, as something to be desired. But war is at the forefront of the Roman mind, of the Roman organizational structure, because the founding of the state, at least in their sort of mythology, was a battle, a war of sorts between Romulus and Remus. And obviously you want status quo to be there, you want peace to be restored, you want stability, as it were. And stability is something to be desired. Now, during the years of the Republic, Rome was not this mighty center of European civilization that it later became, that often people think of it as. Rather, it was a city-state, basically, a small city-state in Italy that had a particular orientation towards war. It said that defense was justified. That's about it. But this concept crept forward from defense being justified in the normal sense, i.e. you can defend yourself if you're repelling an invader, or the nation can defend itself if there is another nation trying to take it, to defense is justified if an enemy declares hostility, that they declare that they're going to attack. And then it moves to a form of preemptive defense. If another nation breaks a treaty, then it's justified to attack in preemptive defense. Until Rome basically went full preemptive. That if some guy looks at you sideways, you can attack him. Went from effectively the guy who would defend himself if he were attacked to the man who literally would go full throttle at you if you look at him the wrong way. Rome justifies this sort of preemptive defense in any way possible, even when it was just doing things that were out of interest of the Republic state. And it uses this sort of preemptive defense in order to build itself up. That's how, partially at least, it becomes so powerful even before the Imperial Age. Now, Rome does justify this defense, but in an academic's paper, I can't remember his name, he put forward a paper and he referred to this sort of preemptive defense as schizophrenic. And I think that's a pretty good way to put it. Rome gets very uneasy very quickly, takes action very quickly when it had suspicious or potentially even reckless states that are neighbouring or nearby. And then through this, it can justify whatever it does. There's no real crystallization of war ethics. It's just this idea of defense in the abstract, and that can be anything from actual defense to purely preemptive if they have any sort of suspicion that any nation harbors any sort of ill will against them or could attack them in the future. And most of these city-states probably weren't going to attack it at the time, but nonetheless, it became perhaps more relaxed, their standards, as time went on throughout the time of the Republic. But that didn't reduce the principle of good defensive war, because they thought that was rather important. Rome, for nearly the entirety of its existence, maintained that unjust war was wrong. Whatever was defined as just war at the period was good, and whatever was unjust risked disfavour from the gods. It was nefas. So, to prevent this, tradition was mainly maintained until polytheism disappeared out of Rome. The top priests would declare that the war was just, and that Rome could basically do whatever it wanted in order to defend itself. And this is their real war ethic. It may seem simple, and that is because largely it is. It's not really a codified system, it's the idea of defense, but they don't really stick too strongly to it, and there's not too much discussion. And once the priests have blessed it, then there's no real risk of divine disfavour, so it's pretty much a free-for-all, apart from sort of ethics within war and treating people reasonably well. Rome also revolutionized the idea of treaties, and this is important because they see there being a sort of jus gentium, a law of all nations. The idea that nations have an obligation to be moral, to be civilized, and to act in that manner, particularly during war, including themselves. They may not have had the most justification or right intention when going into war, other than that, that state looked at me sideways. But nonetheless, in creating these treaties, they established the idea that war should be a moral thing, that trade should not be broken, that if each state acts as Rome sees itself, as the sort of beacon of moral virtue, then everyone's fine and war can be avoided. And we often hear in the latter Imperial Age, latter Imperial Rome, fighting the barbarians, the barbaric Germans and Gauls. Well, the idea of the barbarian comes from these people, the Germans and the Gauls, not fulfilling this moral obligation. They used a form of dishonourable warfare. So Rome, while it doesn't really have very good standards entering war, and basically just justifies it any way it can, calling it defence, when it's actually in war, it does see itself as a higher class, a higher echelon of nation. It sees itself as holding to certain standards which are in accordance with the god's chosen nation. So once Imperial Rome comes into being, things change, for better and worse. Just war is more codified. And throughout the Roman Empire, thanks to Cicero really, there is some sort of codification of war ethics. It's not merely the slogan defense or preemptive defense. And what this means is that there is, to an extent, an enforcement of the idea that war should be defensive, that the enemy should be regarded with some sort of merciful consideration. Cicero has a huge impact. He says that conflict should be addressed by diplomatic discussion first, all other means should be exhausted, and that this is pretty important to proceed with an honourable war, that this is a good way to ensure that war is safe and honourable for the people involved, for the soldiers involved, because that gains favour with the god. So, we see this idea of codified proper motive and sort of just cause, proclamation of the war in proper time, that people should be let in on what's happening, that there should be a demand of restitution if Rome has been wronged, rather than just going in and, destroying the enemy. Cicero lays out some very clear ideas. He said that war should be done in defense or to right a wrong, and that's it. But as we see this later codification, there is simultaneously, moving into the Imperial Age, and even just a bit before the Imperial Age, an ignorance of these standards. Or rather, outright defiance of these standards because they weren't 100% respected. Officially they were held, but as emperors get more power to dictate, high-ranking aristocrats also have more power to basically gain prestige through the army. These ideas of just war are, to an extent, ignored. Officially, there are, ideas maintained that war should be defensive, that war should exhaust diplomatic options, but realistically, it was whatever was expedient to Rome, with reasonable discussion among the emperor and his highest-ranking officials. But the emperor and his highest-ranking officials could be pretty war-hungry. High-ranking aristocrats generally, as I said, gain more prestige through the army. That was a path to prestige in Roman society, even before Caesar. And because of this, because of the great career progression that being in the military offers, the honour that a successful campaign would have to generals, to the emperor, then a lot of high-ranking military officials, men in office, the emperors, think that war is a really good thing, because it gains prestige, it raises the prestige of Rome as a nation, and war ethics, beyond the treatment of people within war, go out the window. So Rome is a story of quite fluctuating jus ad bellum, but not so much fluctuating jus in bello. They see themselves as civilized, they see themselves as presenting a certain honour that Rome has and maintaining this, I guess you'd say, tradition within jus ad bellum officially, but not holding it in reality, and generally holding this jus in bello in reality because it basically helps with military discipline. So in short, what is Rome's war ethic? It's a singular ethic which is only do things in defence, or really to right or wrong, but that they consider moral defence. But that's not always held to. So that's about it for Rome.